Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into a text that's had a huge impact on Western thought for centuries, the Book of
Oh,
Genesis.
yeah. No doubt about that.
We've got this excerpt from a blog post, Scrutinizing Genesis, a secular analysis.
Catchy title.
Gets right to the point, huh? And that's kind of what we're going to do today, too, looking at Genesis from a secular lens.
Makes sense. A lot to unpack there.
Totally. We'll be looking at where it clashes with modern science, and ethics and all that, but also got to acknowledge, the cultural impact is undeniable.
For sure. For sure. It's a foundation for so much.
Right off the bat, the post points out something I never really thought about. Genesis actually has two separate creation stories.
Too. Yeah, it's easy to miss if you're not really paying attention.
Totally. It's like, talk about starting with a bang, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting how these two stories take such different approaches.
Oh, absolutely. The first one, it's all about that structured 6-day creation plan. Like boom, 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 light, sky, land.
Like a cosmic to-do list.
Haha, exactly. But then the second story, it's all about Adam and Eve. Way more personal, intimate.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like the first one gives you the blueprint of the universe, and then the second one zooms in on the first tenets, like you were saying.
Exactly. Give you those personal details. But here's the thing. Both of these creation stories, they kind of clash with what we know now, scientifically speaking.
Yeah, evolutionary biology, for example. It tells us life emerged over billions of years, not just poof all at once.
Right. And speaking of billions of years, there's the whole age of the Earth thing. Some interpretations of Genesis say the Earth is young, like 6,000 to 10,000 years old.
But modern science says our planet is about 4.5 billion years old. So,
Yeah.
yeah, little bit of a difference there.
Just a tad. Haha. And it's not just the science either. Genesis has these stories that raise some pretty big ethical questions, especially by today's standards.
Yeah, like the concept of original sin from the whole Adam and Eve story, right?
Yeah. Right. Are humans inherently flawed from the get-go? That's a tough one to swallow for a lot of people nowadays. We like to think we're basically good, right?
Well, yeah, it's definitely a different perspective than what a lot of people believe these days.
Yeah.
And then there's that story of Abraham being told by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac.
Oh, man. Tough one.
Try to reconcile that with our modern view of, child protection and a parent's responsibility to keep their kids safe. I mean, could you imagine?
It's a gut punch, for sure. Makes you think, was Abraham really right to obey? Does faith mean blind obedience, even when it goes against what you feel is right? Big question.
Huge questions.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole Sodom and Gomorrah story, the way punishment is shown for certain behaviors. Well, let's just say it wouldn't exactly fly today.
No, definitely not. It just shows how much our norms and values have changed over time, right? What might have seemed totally normal, even righteous back then, would be completely unacceptable now.
It's like morality isn't a fixed thing. It evolves as society changes. And speaking of change, the Post also digs into some historical inconsistencies in Genesis. The Noah's Ark story, for example.
Oh, yeah, the flood.
It's got some pretty striking similarities with other ancient flood myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
It really makes you wonder, right? Are these flood stories literal or like more symbolic? Did a global flood even actually happen, or is it more about a universal human fear, natural disasters?
That's a great point. And what about those larger-than-life figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? They're huge in Genesis, but there's not a lot of evidence outside of the Bible to prove they actually existed.
Yeah, that's a debate that goes on and on. Some folks think they might actually represent like whole tribes or social groups, not individual people.
It's like trying to figure out if King Arthur was a real person or just a legend.
Exactly.
All of this really underscores, how we need to approach these texts with a critical eye. Can't just take things at face value.
Right. Dig a little deeper. And that leads us to another thing, how Genesis sometimes contradicts itself. Take the two creation stories, for example. Different timelines, different details.
Yeah, it's confusing. It's like trying to follow a recipe where the steps are all mixed up.
Uh-huh, exactly. And then there's Cain and Abel, right? Raises questions about, like, divine favoritism. Why was Abel's offering better? What made God happy? It makes you wonder if it was even fair.
Definitely a story that gets people talking and thinking. But even with all these inconsistencies, we can't ignore how important Genesis is, right? I mean, it's a cornerstone of both Judaism and Christianity.
Huge impact. Art, literature, our whole way of thinking about morality, family, even the universe, it's all influenced by Genesis.
It's like you can appreciate something for its historical and cultural significance while also analyzing it critically.
Totally. Embracing both the power and the complexity.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about avoiding the tough questions, it's about engaging with them. That's what leads to a deeper understanding.
Couldn't agree more.
Well said. So where do we go from here? I mean, how do we reconcile the influence of Genesis with a secular viewpoint, especially with all these conflicts and contradictions we've been talking about?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? One way to think about it is to see Genesis as like a product of its time. It reflects how people saw the world back then.
So we shouldn't really judge it by today's standards.
Right. It's like imagine trying to understand Shakespeare, without knowing anything about Elizabethan England. The
Yeah.
language, the themes, the social norms, it's all rooted in that specific time and place.
Makes sense. But does that mean we should just see Genesis as like a historical artifact?
Yeah.
Something to study but not really like relevant to our lives now?
Not necessarily. It's important to understand the historical context, sure, but we can also appreciate it for its literary and philosophical value.
Okay, now you've got me interested. Tell me more.
Well, think about it this way. Even if we don't believe in, like, a literal six-day creation, the Genesis account still wrestles with some pretty fundamental questions. Questions humans have been asking forever.
Like, where do we come from? What are we doing here? What does it even mean to be human?
Exactly. Big questions, right? They go way beyond any one time or culture. And Genesis, in its own way, offers some pretty profound answers.
So we can still appreciate it even if we don't take it literally as like a work of imagination.
Yeah. It shows how much we, as humans, want to make sense of the world, figure out those existential questions, and find meaning in life. And we're still doing that today, right?
It's not about choosing sides, faith versus reason. It's about like appreciating both, the historical and the timeless parts of the text.
Exactly. And remember, even from a secular perspective, there are lots of different ways to interpret and understand Genesis.
Oh, for sure. There's no one right answer, right?
Right. People will find different meanings and connect with different parts based on their own experiences and backgrounds.
That's what makes it so interesting to discuss, I guess. It gets you thinking, challenges what you thought you knew, and it can spark some pretty interesting conversations.
Yeah, totally. Open, respectful dialogue about these complex issues. We could all use a bit more of that.
Couldn't agree more. So where does all this leave us? I mean, how do we make sense of Genesis in today's world?
I think the key is to approach it with curiosity and humility.
Humility.
Yeah, humility. Admit that we don't have all the answers. What we understand is always changing, and even in texts that challenge us, we can still find wisdom.
That's a good point. Being open to learning and growing, even if it means questioning some of the things we've always believed.
Exactly. And the goal isn't always to force Genesis and modern thought to, like, perfectly line up. Sometimes just acknowledging the tension, appreciating the different ways people think, that's the best way.
So it's okay to like embrace the mystery, the stuff we don't fully understand.
Absolutely. That's where the most insightful conversations happen. When we admit we don't have all the answers.
I like that. Embrace the mystery. One thing we haven't really talked about is the artistry of Genesis, the way it's written.
Oh, you're right. We've been so focused on the history and the ethics, we kind of forgot about the writing itself.
Easy to do, but it's important to remember that Genesis, at its core, it's all about storytelling. And it's a really, really good story.
What do you mean?
The language, the images, the symbolism, it's all so sophisticated. Even if we don't take the stories literally, the narrative is just powerful and beautiful.
Can you give me an example?
Think about Adam and Eve, right? The Garden of Eden, the serpent, the forbidden fruit. Such powerful symbols, even if we don't believe in a literal talking snake.
It's like an archetype, right? Something that shows up in stories across cultures. Innocence, temptation, consequences.
Exactly. And Genesis is one of the earliest, most powerful examples of that.
So even from a secular perspective, we can find value in the storytelling and how it explores these universal human experiences.
Exactly. I think that's something anyone who reads Genesis, believes it or not, can appreciate.
I agree.
Now, we've talked about a lot, but there's one thing that I'm still wondering about. Is there anything in Genesis, that you still find, I don't know, puzzling? Even after all this discussion and analysis, like something that just doesn't quite make sense to you?
That's a good question. Yeah, there are definitely passages that still make me think, challenge me. But I guess the story of Cain and Abel always kind of stands out.
First murder in the Bible? Yeah, it's a powerful one. What about it puzzles you?
Well, it's God's reaction to the offerings, right? Or rather, how God doesn't accept Cain's offering. Why was Abel's favored? We never really get a clear reason.
Yeah, feels kind of random, right?
Yeah.
Like, what made Abel so much better? No clear answer in the text.
Exactly. And then there's the punishment. Cain is banished, right? Wandering the earth. But he's also given this mark of protection. It's kind of contradictory.
Punishment and protection at the same time. What was the mark even for? To protect him from other people, or a reminder of what he did.
Right. It's been debated for centuries. No easy answers. I think that's part of why it's so interesting, though. Makes you confront some hard truths about being human. Jealousy, anger, the consequences of our actions. It's a story that still resonates, you know? Makes you think.
Yeah, it shows how even these ancient texts can still speak to us today. Even if we don't interpret them literally, there's something there that connects with our own lives.
Absolutely. A window into human experience. The struggles, the triumphs, it's all there right from the beginning.
This whole conversation has really been eye-opening for me. I mean, it's made me see Genesis in a whole new light. It's more than just stories, right? It's about what it means to be a human, our relationship with the divine, trying to find meaning and purpose.
I couldn't agree more. And that's something everyone can take away from it, regardless of what you believe. Genesis invites us to have a conversation, to ask questions, really try to understand. And who knows, maybe in that process, we'll learn something new about ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. That's a perfect way to wrap up our exploration of Genesis. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you keep exploring these ancient texts and keep asking those tough questions. Until next time.